we want to talk about preachers and who needs them. And also, we need to talk about preachers' feet. I was thinking about sitting down and taking off my shoes. But I don't know if I have holes in my socks or not, because preachers have beautiful feet. I don't know if you ever noticed that. Really marvelous looking things. They're actually my best feature. Far and away. We need preachers. But we don't just need people who are called preachers. We need everyone to be involved in this mission of presenting the gospel to the world. And that is what Paul has been talking about today. Now, specifically, he's talking about presenting the gospel to Israel. And he was talking about presenting the gospel to Israel in his day. But this fans out and applies then to all of us. And wherever we go and whatever we do, we are God's preachers. And you all have beautiful feet. Maybe in our next pictorial directory, we should just put people's feet in there. And then you would notice them by their feet. But we need preachers. Now, this particular chapter starts off with Joel, who promises, Paul quotes Joel chapter 2, and promises that God is calling everyone to salvation. And he has promised salvation to everyone who calls on the name of the Lord. This is what we were talking about last week. And then in verses 14 and 21, he expands on that call. He expands on this idea of hearing. He works back from the calling of the Lord all the way through hearing, from believing to hearing, to preaching to sending. So he goes all the way back, working back through those steps: belief and hearing and preaching and sending. Those are the steps that Paul says that God has taken to bring the gospel to the Jews. But then he turns explicitly to that situation in Israel. He says this is generally how it happens, but this is explicitly what happens. And he repeats again the need for the message to be proclaimed if people are going to believe it. When we have to have a message out there for people to understand. We have to tell them about Jesus. We can't just tell them about anybody. We can't just tell them that belief in general is a good thing. We have to tell them specifically that it's belief in Jesus Christ, and we have to proclaim that so that they will come to know Jesus. And then with two Old Testament quotations, he's going to tell us that the Jews have both heard the message and that they have rejected that message as well. And they heard it, understood it, and then rejected. Two more quotations, finish that off, and it ends on the same note that we started with back in chapter 9. Back in chapter 9, he told us that the Jews have heard the word, but they have rejected the word. And he's been trying to explain that situation, basically with the idea that we would become more and more assured of God's trustworthiness because of his behavior to Israel is consistent with his behavior to us. So we can trust in the Lord. He starts off the way he finishes the way he began, with this idea that Gentiles who did not seek God are finding him. Same idea he had in 9:30, he now has in 10:20. While Israel, though offered God's grace, continues to reject it. We found that back in 9:31 and 32. Now we find it here in this chapter as well. So we see that idea as Paul is finishing off this particular section of Scripture with that idea that God is faithful. He is faithful because Jews reject. He is faithful because Gentiles accept. Both of those are examples of God's faithfulness. He also reminds us that Israel is guilty of not understanding and submitting to the righteousness that God presented to the world. Does he say that all Jews are guilty of not accepting Jesus? No. He is saying that most are. It was just a fact of his day that most people in Israel had rejected Jesus Christ. So let's begin looking at this passage and working through it. In the first verses, he starts off with these four rhetorical questions. He says, how can a person preach unless they have been sent? And then he says, how can they hear unless somebody has preached? And how can they preach, how can they believe unless they have heard? And he works back through that entire process. The quotations that he uses to back this idea up come from Isaiah chapter 52 and confirms that the preaching of the gospel is necessary for someone to believe. They have to have content. They have to know who Jesus is. They can't just believe in some vague idea of belief. It also suggests that this last condition for salvation, that preaching is necessary, has already been met. The preachers have been sent. Paul is already there in their lives. God has already done this, so that the whole process has been started and has been going on. The mention of the good news leads him to the central issue. While Israel has heard it, she has not believed it. Isaiah talks about that good news. And blessed are the feet of those who bring good news. And Paul is reminded that the Israelites have not believed that good news that God has brought to them. Now he says that not all of the Jews have believed, but only a few. I put up Aragorn because not all who wander are lost. Not all that glitters is gold. And besides, I like Lord of the Rings. But he wants to say that not all the Jews have, but that really what he means by that is only a few have believed. Not all who are descended from Israel are Israel. In case you don't know, Madonna is not an Israelite. I think she's Italian by descent. And she's currently practicing a form of Judaism called the Kabbalah, and that doesn't make her a believer. Just because she wants to claim some form of Jewish religion doesn't mean that she's a believer. Not all who claim to be descended from Abraham are followers of God. In 10:17, Paul continues, restating the second step that he mentioned back in the verse 14, and that faith comes from hearing. This is a missionary situation where they don't have the written word and they don't have a preacher, but they have this little tape recorder box, or I don't even know, I think it's solid state actually, and they press the button and it plays the gospel message, and it plays the good news of Jesus Christ for them. The last part of verse 17 restates the third step in the salvation sequence, and that is hearing can only happen when they have been presented with a gospel message, an evangelistic message that includes the good news of Jesus Christ. That word is the word of Christ. That message that we read about last week, where Paul says that if we confess with our mouths that Jesus Christ is Lord and believe in our hearts that God raised him from the dead, we will be saved. That is the word that they need to hear. That is the word that we all need to hear. Everyone on this planet needs to hear that message, and that is what they're supposed to believe. Believing in something else doesn't cut it. And so we need to present that message for them to hear. The critical step is in verse 18. Did they not hear? And it expects a positive answer. And our English versions try to put it into a form so that they would expect a positive answer. In Greek, it's actually much more clearer than in English because they have a form that says, if we use this word, we expect a positive answer. And the answer is, of course they did. Of course they heard. God has already sent them messengers. God has already sent them the prophets. God has already sent them evangelists and told them the good news. They have heard. Their voice, according to Psalm 19:4, and he quotes, their voice has gone into all the earth. Everyone has heard. Now, by the way, there's a little guy standing way up there at the end of the world. Everybody, Paul says, according to this verse, has heard. Now, is he saying that the message has gone into all the world? This is a picture of a guy underneath the polar ice cap taking pictures of seals. Did Paul mean that the gospel has been preached underneath the polar ice cap while they're taking photographs of seals? No. What he means is that everyone in this whole entire world has had an opportunity to get to know God and of rejecting him on the basis of what they know. That's what he's trying to say. He picked up the word from the previous quotation, but he follows through on that. Did he mean all the earth? No. Did he mean just the Roman world? I don't think so. I think he says everyone has had the opportunity of knowing Jesus, of knowing God. Now in verse 19, he repeats the same question that he had in verse 18. Now he says, again I ask, and the previous one he said, but I ask, and he's asking again another question.